The first thing people notice about Pelican Bay is the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, watchful quiet that sits over the yard like a warning. Inside those walls live some of the most dangerous inmates in the American prison system. Men who have already proven they can't be controlled in other prisons. Men who have stabbed, ordered hits, run gangs, and turned entire housing units into battlegrounds. Guards who work here understand something very clearly from their first day. Out on the yard, anything can happen. And on one afternoon inside Pelican Bay State Prison, something did. A routine movement of inmates turned into a sudden, violent ambush. A correctional officer found himself surrounded by prisoners armed with homemade blades. The attack lasted only seconds, but the truth behind it would take years to fully understand, because the stabbing on the Pelican Bay yard was not random. It was planned, and the man who survived it would later reveal a hidden world inside the prison, a world of coded signals, secret gang hierarchies, silent threats, and a system where survival often depends on reading danger before it appears. But before we get to that attack, you have to understand the place where it happened. Because Pelican Bay isn't just another prison, it's something else entirely, and the rules inside its walls are unlike anything most people could imagine. Pelican Bay State Prison sits near Crescent City, in one of the most isolated corners of California. Fog rolls in from the Pacific Ocean most mornings, swallowing the surrounding forests and coastline. The location was chosen deliberately. Remote, cold, far from major cities. Built in 1989, the prison was designed for one purpose: control. Specifically, control of inmates who had become too violent for other facilities. Inside Pelican Bay is one of the most infamous units in the American correctional system. The security housing unit. The SHU cells, there are concrete boxes, no windows to the outside world, lights that never fully turn off. Prisoners spend up to 23 hours a day alone. For some inmates, that isolation lasts years, sometimes decades. But the yard where the stabbing would happen was different. This was a general population exercise yard, which meant something very specific. Men from rival gangs shared the same space. And when that happens in a prison like Pelican Bay, tension becomes part of the daily routine. Every movement inside Pelican Bay follows a strict schedule. Morning counts, meal rotations, exercise periods, lockdowns, searches. Everything runs like a controlled machine. But beneath that system, another structure exists, one that guards can see only pieces of. Prison gangs. Inside Pelican Bay, gangs aren't just groups of friends. They are organized power structures, with leadership, rules, and consequences. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and dozens of smaller street gangs. Some of those leaders operate from inside the SHU, meaning they rarely see the outside world, but their influence still reaches the yards. Orders pass through coded letters, lawyers, whispers through cell vents, even simple body language across a yard. A nod, a handshake, a certain way of walking. To someone unfamiliar with prison life, it might look meaningless. But inside Pelican Bay, those signals can decide who lives and who dies. Correctional officers working the yard learn quickly to watch everything. Who stands where, who sits with who avoids certain tables, who suddenly changes routine. Because when patterns break, violence often follows. And that's exactly what happened on the afternoon of the stabbing. The officer who would later survive the attack had already spent years working inside Pelican Bay. He understood the environment, he knew the gangs, and more importantly, he knew the signs that something was wrong. But the day started like any other. Midday yard time. Groups of inmates slowly filtering out from their housing units. Metal doors sliding open one at a time. Guards positioned around the perimeter. In the tower, near the gates, and along the yard walls, the routine seems calm from the outside. But tension is always there. Inmates rarely move randomly. Most yards naturally divide along gang lines. Certain tables belong to certain groups, certain pull-up bars, certain areas near the wall. It's an unspoken system that everyone understands. Cross those invisible boundaries, and problems start. But on this particular day, something subtle changed, and at first, almost no one noticed it. Several inmates from different sections of the yard had quietly shifted their positions. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. A man who usually walked laps stopped and leaned near a wall. Another sat at a table he normally avoided. A third inmate slowly tied his shoe. Again and again. These might seem like meaningless details, but to experienced guards, these small behaviors sometimes signal coordination, preparation, timing, and that's when things took a darker turn, because the officer walking along the yard wall hadn't yet realized that several inmates were watching him, not casually, intently, and among them, someone was carrying a weapon. Not a knife you could buy, not anything obvious, but something handmade, something designed inside a prison cell using pieces of metal, melted plastic, and time. In prison, these weapons have a name: shanks. Improvised blades sharpened against concrete, hidden in clothing, inside shoes, sometimes even inside the body, until the moment they're needed. By the time the guard noticed something strange in the yard, the attack had already begun. It happened fast. Too fast for most people nearby to understand what was unfolding. One inmate approached the officer from the side. Another moved behind him. A third closed the gap from the front. Within seconds, the officer was surrounded, and that's when the blade appeared. A thin strip of sharpened metal, wrapped in cloth at the handle. The first stab came suddenly. A quick thrust toward the officer's torso. Guards train for situations like this, but training doesn't slow time. And in the chaos of the yard, the attack was unfolding faster than the response. The officer tried to create distance, but the second inmate lunged forward, and the blade struck again. This time higher, closer to the chest. Sirens began to echo across the yard. From the towers, from the control booth, guards shouting orders, inmates dropping to the ground. But the men carrying the weapons didn't stop, because what happened next suggested this attack had been carefully planned. And the target might not have been random at all, but the truth behind that plan would only start to emerge later. And when investigators began asking questions inside Pelican Bay, they uncovered something even more disturbing about how violence is organized inside prison walls. Something that almost no one outside the system ever sees. And it started with the simple question: who ordered the stabbing? And why was this officer chosen? The moment the alarm sounded, the entire yard changed. Inside Pelican Bay, alarms are never ignored. Every officer knows that when that siren begins, seconds matter. Towers immediately lock onto the disturbance. Armed guards position rifles through narrow observation slots. Radios erupt with overlapping commands. Yard down, but the stabbing had already begun. The officer staggered backward, instinctively raising his arms to shield his chest. The blade had already found its mark once, and the man holding it was closing the distance again. Another inmate moved beside him, not striking yet, watching, almost like a lookout. And that detail would later become incredibly important, because attacks inside prison yards often fall into two categories: spontaneous violence or organized hits. Spontaneous fights are chaotic, loud, messy. Prisoners scream, swing wildly, and the moment quickly spirals out of control. But organized hits are different. They are fast, precise, and usually involve more than one person. What happened on the Pelican Bay yard that afternoon looked disturbingly like the second kind. The attacker lunged again. The blade drove forward, aiming low this time, but the officer twisted away just enough that the strike caught his side instead of his abdomen. Still dangerous, still deep enough to cause serious damage, but not immediately fatal. And that tiny difference would mean the officer had seconds, instead of none. Seconds to fight back, seconds to survive. Because in that moment, one brutal reality existed inside the yard. The responding officers were still running across open ground, and the man being attacked was alone. The officer stumbled toward the wall, reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder. Blood had already begun soaking through the fabric of his uniform. But even injured, training took over. He shouted commands. Down, get down. The attackers ignored him. One of them moved in again, And that's when something unusual happened. Instead of stabbing immediately, the inmate hesitated, just for a moment. He looked past the officer, across the yard, toward another group of inmates. It lasted less than a second, but it looked like he was waiting for something, waiting for confirmation, and that single glance would later make investigators question the entire nature of the attack. Because in prisons with powerful gang hierarchies, violence is rarely random. Every action can carry meaning. Every strike can send a message. But the officer didn't know any of that in the moment. He only knew he was bleeding, and the men in front of him were still armed. He lunged forward suddenly, not away, but directly into the closest attacker. It was a risky move, but it disrupted the rhythm of the assault. The inmate holding the weapon stumbled as the officer slammed into him. The blade fell from the man's hand, clattering across the concrete. For a split second, everything froze. Then the second attacker moved, and what he did next made it clear the plan had never depended on just one weapon. Another blade, shorter but sharper. Improvised weapons inside prisons are often made in multiples. If one is lost, another appears, and the second attacker now held the advantage. He stepped forward quickly. The officer raised his arm to block. The blade sliced across his forearm instead of his chest. Pain shot through him instantly, but again, the strike missed its intended target, and by then, the rest of the yard was reacting. Officers were closing in. Inmates were dropping to the ground as orders echoed through the air. Down, face down. A tower officer shouted warnings through a loudspeaker, and from above, a rifle was now trained directly at the attackers. Inside prison yards, lethal force is always the last option. But the moment an officer's life is clearly in danger, those rules change. The attackers knew that, and they knew time was running out. So the second inmate made one final attempt. He rushed forward. The blade came up again. And that's when backup finally reached the scene. Two officers slammed into the attacker from the side. The weapon skidded across the yard. Another guard tackled the first inmate, forcing his hands behind his back. Within seconds, both men were pinned against the ground. Cuffs snapped shut. The yard filled with shouting, radios, and the pounding footsteps of responding staff. But amid all the chaos, one detail stood out. The inmates who had been sitting at nearby tables, the ones who had watched the attack begin, none of them moved. They stayed flat on the concrete, silent, looking down. Inside prison culture, that silence can mean many things: fear, loyalty, or knowledge. The injured officer was quickly pulled away from the scene. Blood streaked across the pavement where he had stood. Medical staff rushed in through the yard gate, and within minutes, he was being escorted toward the prison infirmary. But the questions were only beginning, because as investigators secured the yard and began searching the attackers, they found something troubling. Neither man appeared to be acting alone, and the signs of coordination had been everywhere. The repositioning of inmates, the lookout, the hesitation, the second blade. This hadn't been a random explosion of violence. This had been organized, which raised a much more dangerous question. Who ordered it? Because inside Pelican Bay, attacks like this are rarely approved without someone higher in the chain giving the word. And that chain often leads somewhere unexpected. Not the yard, not the housing unit, but deep inside the prison's most controlled and isolated section, the security housing unit, the SHU, where some of the most powerful gang leaders in California's prison system have spent years directing violence from behind solid concrete walls. And investigators soon discovered something else. One of the attackers had recently received a visit, a legal visit, the kind that allows private conversations, no recording, no monitoring, just an inmate and someone on the outside. And what that visitor had delivered inside the prison might have been far more dangerous than a weapon. It might have been an order that nearly cost a correctional officer his life. But the deeper investigators dug into the case, the stranger the story became. Because the officer who survived the stabbing wasn't just another guard, and there were rumors circulating quietly among inmates that someone had wanted him specifically. Not any officer, him. which raised the most disturbing question of all. What had he done to become a target? The officer was still conscious when they brought him into the prison infirmary. That alone surprised the medical staff. Most stabbing victims arriving from a prison yard are barely responsive. Blood loss, shock, internal injuries. Those are common outcomes when a sharpened piece of metal finds its way inside a human body. But somehow, this officer had stayed on his feet long enough for backup to arrive. Still, the damage was serious. The stab wound to his side had cut deep through muscle. The slash across his forearm had opened a long gash that required immediate stitches. His uniform was soaked through, and yet, what he kept repeating to the nurse wasn't about the pain. It was a warning. They were waiting for me. At first, that statement didn't seem unusual. Victims of violent incidents often replay the moment over and over in their minds. Details blur, assumptions fill the gaps. But as investigators later listened to his full account, the meaning behind that sentence became much more unsettling. Because the officer believed the attack had not only been planned, he believed he had been specifically chosen, and that possibility would immediately shift the investigation in a much more dangerous direction. Within hours, internal investigators began interviewing everyone involved. The attackers were separated and placed in holding cells. Witness inmates were identified, and every officer who had been on the yard that afternoon was questioned. In incidents like this, the first hours matter the most. Memories are still fresh. Small observations can still surface. And sometimes, inmates accidentally reveal more than they intend to. But the men who carried out the stabbing weren't talking. Not a word. Not during the first interview. Not during the second. And certainly not when investigators asked the obvious question. Who told you to do it? Inside prison culture, answering that question carries its own consequences. Talking can label someone a snitch, and inside a place like Pelican Bay, that label can follow an inmate for life, or end it. So silence was expected. But investigators weren't relying only on interviews. They were also looking at patterns, because attacks rarely appear out of nowhere. They leave traces beforehand, unusual movements, messages, changes in behavior, and one of the first clues came from something surprisingly simple: the yard seating chart. Every yard period inside Pelican Bay is monitored and recorded. Guards and towers document which inmates are present, which groups gather together, where officers patrol. At first glance, the yard on the day of the stabbing looked normal. Groups of inmates clustered in their usual areas. Exercise equipment occupied. Some men walking laps. But when investigators studied the footage more closely, the pattern shifted. 3 inmates had moved positions shortly before the attack. One had taken up a spot along the wall where the officer normally passed during patrol. Another had chosen a table directly across the yard. And the third had been the lookout. He never attacked. He never touched a weapon, but he had the clearest view of the officer's movement. And seconds before the first strike, he gave a subtle signal, a quick adjustment of his shirt sleeve, barely noticeable, unless someone knew exactly what they were watching. That small motion suggested coordination, and coordination meant planning. But what happened next during the investigation made the situation even more complicated. Because when prison officials pulled the attackers' recent records, they found something unusual. Neither inmate had any recent disciplinary issues with that officer. No arguments. No searches gone wrong. No reports written against them. In fact, the officer had barely interacted with them at all, which raised an unsettling possibility. If the attackers didn't know him personally, then the motive might not be personal at all. It might be organizational. And that's when investigators began looking deeper into gang activity inside the prison. To understand what might have triggered the attack, investigators turned their attention toward the security housing unit. The SHU at Pelican Bay has long been known as one of the most controlled environments in the U.S. prison system. Inmates there spend nearly all day alone. Cells are made of poured concrete. Communication between prisoners is restricted. But history has shown that isolation does not necessarily equal silence. Some of the most powerful prison gang leaders in California have spent decades inside the SHU. And despite the restrictions, their influence still spreads across the prison system. Orders move through coded letters, through family members, through legal visits, sometimes even through small signals exchanged during limited yard periods. Investigators reviewing the stabbing began tracing the attackers' connections. Both inmates had gang affiliations, different gangs, but both connected in distant ways to larger prison networks. That alone wasn't unusual. Gang membership inside Pelican Bay is common, but something else stood out. Just 3 days before the attack, one of the inmates had received a legal visit, and that visit lasted nearly 2 hours. Long enough for a detailed conversation, long enough for instructions. But what made the visit especially interesting was the identity of the person who came to see him. It wasn't family. It wasn't a typical attorney. It was a legal representative linked to an outside organization that had been communicating with several inmates inside the SHU. On paper, nothing about the visit was illegal. Legal meetings are protected, private, unmonitored. But inside prison investigations, timing can speak volumes. And the timing of that visit, followed almost immediately by a coordinated attack, raised serious concerns. Still, there was another piece of the puzzle investigators hadn't yet solved. Why this officer? Out of hundreds of correctional staff inside Pelican Bay, why him? And the answer to that question would begin to emerge only after they examined something most people never think about: the daily routines of prison guards. Because while inmates live under strict control, officers develop patterns too. And sometimes those patterns become predictable. Predictable enough for someone watching carefully to exploit. But the truth behind how the attackers might have learned those routines would soon reveal something even more disturbing about the prison yard that day. Because the men who stabbed the officer weren't the only ones involved. Not even close. In the hours after the stabbing, the prison yard remained locked down. No movement, no talking, just rows of inmates lying face down on the concrete, while officers methodically escorted them back to their housing units. Pelican Bay had entered emergency protocol. Incidents involving staff assaults are treated with the highest level of scrutiny. Every square foot of the yard would be searched. Every inmate involved would be isolated. Every piece of footage would be reviewed frame by frame. But even as the investigation began unfolding, one uncomfortable truth had already become clear. The attack had not been spontaneous. Too many pieces had lined up perfectly. The positioning of inmates, the lookout, the second weapon, the timing of the strike during the officer's patrol route. Someone had studied the environment carefully, and that meant there was still someone investigators hadn't identified. The person who planned it. Search teams worked the yard for hours. Prison-made weapons are rarely discarded randomly. Most inmates know that investigators will comb the scene with careful attention. But sometimes, attackers prepare backups. And by late evening, officers recovered something unexpected. A third weapon, hidden near the base of the yard wall, wrapped tightly in cloth. Another improvised blade, sharpened to a narrow point. What made it unusual wasn't just its existence. It was its location. The weapon had been placed along the exact path the officer typically walked during patrol, meaning it had likely been hidden there before the yard period even started. That discovery changed the entire interpretation of the attack, because it meant the attackers had planned multiple possibilities. If the first blade failed, if the officer fought back, if the situation became chaotic, there would still be another weapon nearby. This wasn't a desperate act of prison violence. This was preparation, and preparation inside a maximum security yard requires cooperation. More than 2 people, more than 3, which meant that when investigators began isolating inmates for questioning, they were no longer just looking for attackers. They were looking for accomplices, and perhaps even someone higher in the chain, someone who had given the order. Meanwhile, inside the security housing unit, word about the yard stabbing traveled quickly. Despite isolation, news always finds a way to spread inside prison walls. A message through plumbing pipes, a whisper during escort, a coded note slipped through laundry exchange. Inmates began discussing the attack quietly, and according to later intelligence reports, one phrase surfaced repeatedly: green light. Inside gang-controlled environments, a green light carries a specific meaning: authorization, permission, sometimes even an order to commit violence against a specific target. And when investigators heard inmates referencing that phrase, They began examining something else: the officer's work history. Because earlier rumors had suggested that he might have been singled out, now investigators needed to know why. And the answer they discovered took them back nearly 6 months before the attack. 6 months earlier, the officer had participated in a major contraband search inside one of the housing units. The operation had uncovered several items: improvised weapons, gang communication notes, and most importantly, a list. Not just any list. A coded roster believed to contain names connected to a prison gang hierarchy. For investigators, that document had been extremely valuable, but for the gang whose structure had been exposed, the search had been humiliating. Inside gang culture, losing sensitive information to staff carries serious consequences, and sometimes retaliation follows. But proving that connection would be nearly impossible. Orders inside prison gangs rarely appear in writing. They travel through layers of communication. By the time violence occurs, the original instruction is often impossible to trace. Still, investigators now had a theory. The attack had not been personal. It had been symbolic. A message. A reminder to staff that disrupting gang operations comes with risks. And perhaps even more importantly, a signal to inmates that the gang still held power. But the story of the Pelican Bay yard stabbing doesn't end with the attack itself. Because the man at the center of it, the officer who survived, still had months of recovery ahead of him. And what he experienced afterward revealed something about prison life that many people never consider: the psychological cost of surviving violence. Recovery from a stabbing isn't just physical. The officer's wounds eventually healed. The stitches came out, the scars faded, but the memory of those seconds on the yard remained sharp. Many correctional officers describe similar experiences after violent incidents. The moment replaying in their minds, the sound of the alarm, the flash of the blade, the realization that help might not arrive in time. For months, the officer struggled with returning to work, but eventually, he did. Not because the fear disappeared, but because, for many correctional staff, walking away from the job means letting violence win. So he returned to Pelican Bay, returned to the same walls, the same yard, the same routines, but now with a deeper understanding of just how quickly normalcy can collapse. Because inside prisons like Pelican Bay, danger rarely announces itself. It waits quietly, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until the moment someone decides it's time. In the end, the investigation into the yard stabbing produced arrests and disciplinary actions for the inmates directly involved. The attackers were transferred to the most restrictive housing available. Their time on General Yard permanently ended, but the question of who ultimately ordered the assault remains less certain. Inside prison systems, truth often moves in shadows. Layers of silence protect those at the top, and violence becomes just another tool used to maintain power. The Pelican Bay yard stabbing was only one moment in a much larger story. A story about how control, fear, loyalty, and survival shape life inside maximum security prisons, where guards and inmates operate within the same environment, but under very different rules, and where a single glance across a yard can mean far more than it appears. For the officer who survived that afternoon, the lesson was simple but chilling. In a place built to contain danger, danger is never fully contained. It only waits, watching, learning routines, waiting for the moment when attention slips, even briefly. And when that moment arrives, everything can change in seconds. Stories like this reveal something uncomfortable about life inside prison walls. The reality is far more complex than most people imagine. Behind the routines, the counts, the gates, and the razor wire, there exists a constant struggle for control, a quiet war of influence and survival. And sometimes, those hidden conflicts spill into the open in the most violent ways. The Pelican Bay yard stabbing is a reminder that every prison incident has layers. Layers of planning, layers of power, layers of silence. And sometimes, the full truth remains buried long after the alarms stop ringing. But one thing is certain: on that day, one correctional officer walked onto the yard expecting another routine shift. And within seconds, he found himself fighting for his life. A moment that could have easily ended differently. A moment that still echoes through the walls of Pelican Bay. And a moment that exposes just how thin the line between order and chaos can be inside the most controlled environments on Earth. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more real cases from inside prisons and the criminal world, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like if you want to see more documentaries like this, and share your thoughts or questions in the comments. And if this story left you thinking, consider sharing it, because the next case we examine reveals an even darker side of life behind bars. Stay tuned for the next video. It's one you won't want to miss.